The car sat in the corner of the auction hall, like something nobody had bothered to throw away yet. Dust covered the hood in a thin gray film. The paint had blistered and peeled along the fenders, and the handwritten lot tag, dangling from the side, mirror read $5,000 to $8,000. No reserve. Nobody stood near it. Nobody even glanced at it. And then Renata Osibansu, the CEO of Osibansu Legacy Auctions, the most powerful name in high-end estate sales in Atlanta, walked past it, looked down at the man crouching beside it with a small flashlight in his hand, and said 4 words that everyone in earshot heard clearly. Scrap metal, no value. The man in the worn work jacket did not stand up. He did not argue. He just kept looking at the undercarriage with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who already knew something the room did not. What did Darius Chambliss see in that car that an entire auction house full of experts missed? The answer is worth $8 million, and it starts with a lesson his father taught him a long time ago. Darius Chambliss loaded the last of his tools into the passenger footwell of his pickup at 6:45 on a Tuesday morning, checked the side mirror out of habit, and pulled out of the narrow street in Mechanicsville, where his repair shop occupied the ground floor of converted warehouse. Its brick facade dark with years of weather and the faint outline of an old paint advertisement still visible on the side wall if the afternoon light came in at the right angle. The sky was that particular shade of pale gray that comes before the city fully wakes up, and the traffic on the connector was still light enough that he could see the downtown towers clearly against the early morning haze. Kezia sat in the seat beside him, 6 years old, her stuffed brown bear she called Biscuit tucked firmly under one arm. She had her mother's habit of waking up completely alert. No groggy transition, just eyes open and already asking questions, already fully present in the world, as though sleep were merely a door she had stepped through quickly and then left behind without a second thought. "What's your favorite car in the whole world?" she asked, adjusting Biscuit's ears with the focused seriousness of someone arranging something important, something that required precision and care. Darius thought about it for a moment, the way he always thought about Kezia's questions, not quickly, because she always knew when an answer was rushed, and she would sit with a rushed answer and hold it up to the light the way a jeweler holds a stone, turning it slowly until she found the place where it did not catch correctly. "A car nobody's looked at the right way yet," he said. She nodded, as if this made complete sense. She settled back in the seat and watched the billboards pass overhead in the thinning gray light, and Darius kept his eyes on the road. 3 years earlier, Darius had been a chassis engineer with a small but respected Formula Heritage racing team, a position he had earned not through connections but through the kind of obsessive mechanical knowledge that makes other engineers too uncomfortable at dinner, because the conversation only ever goes one place, and most people prefer conversations that go several places and in somewhere pleasant. His father, Cornelius Chambliss, had spent 40 years documenting the history of black-owned and black-operated American racing manufacturers, a subject that occupied an almost invisible corner of the broader automotive record, a corner Cornelius had spent his entire adult life insisting deserved a much larger room. His particular fixation had been Drummond Racing, a short-lived Birmingham company founded in 1959 by 3 brothers who had learned mechanics in their grandfather's filling station on the old highway south of the city and had produced some of the most technically sophisticated factory prototype cars of the early 1960s before a warehouse fire in 1965 had reportedly destroyed most of what they built. Cornelius had talked about the D12 the way other fathers talked about legendary fish they had almost caught. The only factory prototype, the first one off the line, gone probably, but not certainly. Darius had grown up with that story the way other children grow up with fairy tales. One of those stories that lives somewhere between history and hope, occupying the uncertain space where family's understanding of itself is quietly formed. His wife, Naomi, had died in a traffic accident when Kezia was 3 years old. Darius had left the racing team 6 months later, not because he could not handle the work, but because a paddock in Valencia and a 3-year-old in Mechanicsville are not compatible in the way that matters most, and Darius was a man who had always known, in the wordless way that some men know certain things, exactly which things mattered most. He opened a repair shop. He learned how to pack school lunches. He learned which cartoons Kezia preferred in the mornings and which ones she preferred in the evenings and what the difference was. He kept his father's research binders on a shelf above his workbench, their spines worn at the top from years of being pulled down and put back, each one filled with Cornelius's careful handwriting, the dense, slanting script of a man who wrote as though he were running out of time but refused to hurry. Today he was driving to the Midtown neighborhood for a morning preview at an Osei Bonsu Legacy estate sale. The kind of event where old money's furniture and forgotten collections get cataloged and sold in rooms with high ceilings and good lighting and the particular ambient atmosphere of careful wealth being carefully transacted. He was not there for the antique silver or the 19th century landscape paintings. He was there for anything mechanical, anything overlooked, anything in the back of the catalog that the main bidders would ignore because they had already decided before entering the room what was worth their attention and what was not. He parked the truck 2 blocks from the address, signed Kezia into the complimentary care room that Osei Bonsu Legacy provided near the main entrance, a small room with beanbag chairs and a table of art supplies and a bookshelf that someone had clearly curated with some thought, kissed the top of her head, and walked through the tall front doors of the venue with his flashlight in his jacket pocket and his father's voice somewhere behind his eyes. The main hall was high-ceilinged and already crowded with preview guests, all of them moving with the particular confidence of people accustomed to being in rooms where expensive things are displayed, accustomed to the experience of standing near things of value and conducting themselves accordingly. Darius moved along the edges, reading the lot tags methodically, pausing at a set of vintage tire-changing equipment and a crated collection of dashboard gauges from the 1950s. And then he turned the corner near the back wall and stopped. The car was pushed against the wall between 2 storage racks of framed artwork, half blocked by a rolling equipment cart, positioned as though whoever had placed it there had been actively trying to keep it out of the way, to minimize its presence in the room, to give it as little space as a thing of so little apparent value deserved. The paint, a dull olive green, was not original, not by decades. The bodywork was wrong for any production model he recognized, modified or partially stripped. The fender lines altered in ways that suggested the car had passed through many hands over many years, each of them leaving some small mark. But underneath all of that, visible only if you knew precisely where to look, the proportions of the roofline were unusual in a very specific way, a particularity of dimension and angle that Darius had only ever seen described in words, in the careful, dense paragraphs of his father's research binders, and had never expected to see in person. Darius crouched down and turned on his flashlight. He was still crouched there, angled beneath the driver's side door when he heard footsteps stop nearby. He looked up. Renata Osei was watching him with an expression that combined mild curiosity and something closer to impatience, the look of someone interrupted by a problem they did not ask for and did not particularly want. She was wearing a tailored ivory suit, and her hair was pulled back with the kind of effortless precision that requires considerable effort. And her junior appraiser, a younger woman with a clipboard who Darius would later learn was named Simone Adeyemi, stood a half-step behind her with the poised alertness of someone who has learned to be useful without being visible. Renata looked at the car, then at Darius, then at the car again, with the brief, efficient appraisal of someone who had already decided before looking. "This lot has no real value," she said, her voice carrying cleanly in the high-ceilinged room. "It's here as a courtesy to the estate family. We did not want to refuse them." She paused, letting the silence settle, and then added with a small precision that landed exactly where she intended it to land. "I'm not sure this preview is the right fit for certain budget ranges." A few of the other preview guests nearby glanced over. One or two almost smiled, the particular restrained smile of people who have understood a social communication and are indicating their receipt of it. Darius did not stand up immediately. He looked at the car for another 2 seconds, the flashlight still in his hand, and then he stood and met Renata's eyes without any particular expression, the steady, unreadable face of someone who has decided in advance that other people's assessments of him are neither here nor there. "Thank you for letting me know," he said. She moved on. Darius turned back to the car and looked at the firewall through the gap behind the fender. Simone Adeyemi lingered for a moment, not obviously, just a beat longer than she needed to, the way a person lingers when something has snagged their attention and they have not yet decided what to do with that fact. When Darius glanced at her, she looked away first. A man in a charcoal suit appeared briefly at the edge of the hall. Broad-shouldered, a thick gold watch on the wrist, the easy, unhurried movement of someone who had spent a great deal of time in rooms like this and had long since stopped finding them remarkable. He was Terrence Beaumont, a mid-level collector and dealer who had been buying and flipping specialty automotive lots for 2 decades, a man who had built a comfortable business on the habit of seeing what other people missed or thought he had. He looked at Lot 47 with the quick practice glance of someone sorting through a bin for something worth saving, found nothing that interested him, and moved on through the doorway toward the courtyard where coffee was being served. Darius glanced toward the care room. Through the glass panel in the door, he could see Kezia standing at the window, biscuit under her arm, watching him. He gave her a small nod. She gave him one back and turned away. Darius pocketed the flashlight and walked to the registration desk. The bidding room filled to about 60% capacity for the main session, and it thinned considerably after the marquee lots. A collection of estate jewelry and 2 significant paintings cleared in the first 40 minutes. Lot 47 was called near the end of the session after the crowd had redistributed into smaller clusters of people checking their phones and finishing their coffee and conducting the quiet private calculus of people deciding whether to stay for the remainder of the afternoon or call it done. The auctioneer, an Osei Bonsu staff member filling in for the final stretch, announced it with the same brisk neutral tone used for everything else. Lot 47, automotive item. Estimated 5,000 to 8,000. Sold as is. No warranty. No reserve. Bidding opens at 3,000. 3,000 became 5,000 in the first 30 seconds, which surprised nobody, the low automatic movement of numbers finding their obvious floor. And then the room went quiet again, the way rooms go quiet when nobody particularly wants something, a particular quality of stillness that is different from the quiet of anticipation. Darius raised his paddle at 8,000. Terrence Beaumont, positioned in a far corner with his arms crossed, noticed the bid and looked across the room for the first time with genuine attention, the focused awareness of a man who has been surprised. He raised his own paddle, 9,000, with the automatic reflex of a man who dislikes losing to anyone, even for things he did not especially want a moment before. Darius, 11,000. Terrence Beaumont studied him across the room. The work jacket, the careful posture, the way the man was watching the car rather than the auctioneer, with the fixed concentration of someone watching something they already understand, already own in some interior sense that precedes the formal transaction. And then Terrence Beaumont set his paddle down on the armrest. Not worth it, his expression said. Whatever this is, it isn't worth a bidding war with a man who looks at a car like that. The gavel came down. Simone Adeyemi was handling the paperwork at the side table, and she slid the bill of sale across the counter without making it obvious that she was watching Darius's face. "What did you see in it?" she asked, quiet enough that it would not carry. Darius signed his name on the line. "I'm not certain yet," he said, "but I think I will know by the end of the week." Kezia was waiting by the main entrance with a volunteer, biscuit on her shoulder, watching the loading crew attach the small crane hook to the car's chassis. "It's really dirty," she said when Darius lifted her up so she could see better. "It has been waiting a long time," he said. He buckled her into the truck, glanced in the rearview mirror at the car, now secured on the flatbed behind them, and drove back south through the city toward Mechanicsville. He worked alone in the shop that first night after Kezia was asleep, the overhead LED bars turning the space a clean, shadowless white, and Darius moved around the car in a slow, outward-in pattern, the same approach his father had always used, starting with the body and working toward what the body was hiding, peeling back the layers of visible history to find what lay beneath them. The welds on the inner structure were the first thing. Not amateur work, not production line automation. These were hand-applied spot welds with a distinctive spacing pattern that dated to a specific period and a specific tier of fabrication. Professional race team construction, circa early 1960s. He photographed everything with his phone, each frame composed carefully enough that the resolution would hold under magnification, Each image a piece of the argument he was already building in his mind, the argument that he was not yet ready to make to anyone except himself. He worked without music, which was his habit when something required the kind of concentration that sound interrupted. When the thing demanding attention was important enough, the room had to be quiet, because silence creates a particular quality of attention that is different from the attention you bring to a noisy room, and some things can only be found in that particular quality. He opened the hood. The engine block sat in the bay with the quiet authority of something that had been built to do one specific thing extremely well. He angled the flashlight toward the left face of the block, the inner surface, the one most people ignored because it faced the firewall and required you to essentially put your head inside the engine bay to see it properly, which most people were not willing to do. The casting mark was there, pressed into the iron, raised numerals. 07-1963. July 1963. Darius did not make a sound. He held the light steady and read the mark 3 times. His father had described this mark in an audio recording that Darius had transferred his phone years ago and listened to so many times he could recite it from memory. The way you recite the things that matter, the things whose weight you carry without noticing because you have been carrying them so long, they have become part of your own weight. If you ever find a block cast in the summer of '63 with the DR prefix on the chassis, you look for the chassis plate immediately. Do not stop for anything. He withdrew his head from the engine bay, stood up straight, and for a moment he simply breathed. The chassis plate in the standard location had been removed. The mounting holes were there, slightly darkened with age, the thread pattern intact, but empty. This was not unusual for a car that had passed through many hands over 60 years, each pair of hands leaving something and taking something. What mattered was the secondary location. Factory race cars of that era almost always had a backup identification point, a fallback stamp applied by the build team, and placed somewhere inconvenient enough that a casual disassembly would miss it. Darius removed the glove compartment housing for screws, a 10-minute job, and reached into the recess behind it with a handheld lamp. The stamp was there, cut directly into the frame rail. 6 characters. DRT pierwsze. He sat down on the shop floor with his back against the rear wheel and stayed there for a while in the clean white light of the overhead lamps, with the city quiet outside and the fan of a refrigerator in the back office cycling on and off and the distant sound of a truck on the interstate several blocks away. DRTW 0001. The chassis number of the Drummond D12, the only one ever built. The car that the historical record said had burned in the Drummond Racing warehouse fire on the 22nd of October, 1965. He got up, went back to the firewall, and checked the third thing. Behind the engine bay, pressed between the 2 layers of the firewall structure, a hand-welded reinforcement bar ran diagonally across the upper section. The weld angle was not perfectly symmetrical. It was not meant to be. It was the deliberate signature of a craftsman who worked by feel rather than jig, approximately 71 degrees of angle, a habit so individual, so rooted in one man's particular way of holding a torch and reading heat, that had been documented in a single technical history paper published 28 years ago by the Southern Automotive Heritage Foundation. The paper's author had described the technique as belonging exclusively to one man, Chief Fabricator Monroe Givens, who had hand-welded every Drummond factory prototype from 1961 through 1965, a man who had learned to weld in the Navy and come home to Birmingham with skills that the Drummond brothers recognized immediately and compensated accordingly, making him the highest-paid fabricator in their operation. Mia appeared in the shop doorway at 3 in the morning. Not Mia, Kezia. Kezia appeared in the shop doorway at 3 in the morning, her hair uncombed, biscuit hanging from one hand, bare feet on the concrete step, wearing the expression of a child who has woken to an absence in the apartment above and come to locate it. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm fine," Darius said. "Go back to sleep." She looked at him, then at the car, with the evaluating gaze that children deploy when they suspect adults are underreporting. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Darius looked at the car for a long moment. "I think I might have," he said. She padded back to bed. He heard her feet on the stairs, then the quiet of the apartment resuming above him. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he had not used in 2 years. Dr. Evangeline Ford was 68 years old, retired from the directorship of the Southern Automotive Heritage Foundation and the only living authority on Drummond Racing's factory operations. She was also the granddaughter of Monroe Givens. Darius had met her twice in person, once as a child when his father had brought him to a symposium in Birmingham, and once as an adult when Darius was still with the racing team and Dr. Ford had come to authenticate a set of period documents connected to another project. She was a woman of specific and formidable knowledge, the kind of person who can walk into a room of experts and quietly restructure the hierarchy of who knows what by speaking 3 sentences in a particular order. When Darius called at 8 in the morning on the 3rd day, he did not explain the full situation. He simply read 3 pieces of information from his notes. July 1963, DRTW 0001. Hand-welded firewall bar, approximately 71 degrees. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Darius checked to see if the call had dropped. Then Dr. Ford said, in a voice that had become very quiet and very careful, "Send me photographs. Every photograph you have." Right now, Darius sent 53 images. 2 hours later, Dr. Ford called back on video. She had a colleague with her, a man named Dr. Albert Mensah, a Ghanaian-American automotive historian who had spent 15 years compiling the most complete record of mid-century black-owned racing enterprises in the American South, and whose book on the subject was considered the definitive text in the small but serious scholarly community that cared about such things. Dr. Mensah went through the photographs one by one without speaking for close to 25 minutes. When he finally spoke, he addressed his first comment not to Darius, but to the image of the firewall bar on the screen in front of him. "The weld," he said, 71 degrees. "This is Monroe Givens's technique." Dr. Ford translated the weight of that, though it needed no translation. "My grandfather welded this car." She was not talking to Darius. She was talking to the screen, or to the image on the screen, or to something behind the image that only she could see. There was a silence in the call that was different from ordinary silence. The kind that comes when something long believed impossible turns out to be simply unlikely, which is a different category entirely, with entirely different implications. Dr. Ford looked at Darius through the screen and spoke directly. "If the engine is original, unmolested, unreplaced, and if the chassis stamp is what you say it is, then what you have is the D12. The only one. There is no second car. The fire destroyed the records and the components in the warehouse, but not the car itself. The car was not there." Darius asked the question that needed asking. "Estimated value." Dr. Ford was quiet for a moment. "We need formal authentication before anyone says a number. But speaking conservatively about the current market for factory prototype race cars of this historical significance, and given the particular history involved, I would say 7 to 9 million is a careful estimate. It could go higher. The story attached to this car is not merely mechanical. It is cultural, and the market understands that now in ways it did not 20 years ago." Darius ended the call. He set the phone face down on the workbench and stood at the shop window looking out at the narrow street below, where a woman was walking a dog and a delivery truck was idling at the corner, and the morning was proceeding with its usual complete indifference to the thing that had just happened in this room. Across the sidewalk, Kezia was in the small fenced yard beside the shop building, walking Biscuit along the top of the fence railing with great concentration, narrating a story to herself in a voice too low to hear through the glass, completely absorbed in the private logic of whatever world she was building. Darius watched her for a long time. Then he turned back to the shop and began preparing the car for a more thorough inspection. The black SUV appeared outside the shop at 9 in the morning on the 5th day. Darius saw it from the second-floor window while he was making coffee. Idling engine, tinted glass, the specific quality of stillness that belongs to a vehicle waiting for its driver to do something rather than go somewhere. Terrence Beaumont came through the front door without knocking, which was not a surprise because men like Terrence Beaumont did not knock on the doors of repair shops in Mechanicsville. He had a young attorney with him, briefcase, precisely cut suit, the slightly rigid bearing of someone who had been told this would be a short meeting and was already thinking about the next one. Terrence looked at the shop, the tools hung on pegboard, the lift hydraulics, the calendar from a part supplier on the wall, with an expression that managed to be simultaneously unimpressed and calculating. The expression of a man taking inventory of a room he has already decided tells him everything he needs to know about the man who occupies it. "You bought a car at the Oseibansu session 5 days ago," he said. "I bought a car," Darius confirmed. "Everything processed correctly. I have the paperwork." Terrence smiled with one side of his mouth. "I'm not here about the paperwork. I want to buy it back from you." The attorney placed an open folder on Darius's workbench. A contract already prepared, a number printed in bold at the top. $200,000. Wire transfer, same day. Darius did not look at the folder. "No," he said. Terrence paused in a way of a man unaccustomed to that word being the first and only one offered, delivered without preamble or qualification or any of the social softening that the word usually wears when it is spoken in a room like this, between men of this particular disparity of apparent position. "You paid $11,500. I am offering $200,000. That is a reasonable offer." "No," Darius said again, the same way. Terrence's expression shifted into something more deliberate. The social surface replaced by the face he presumably wore in negotiations he expected to win, the face of someone who has practiced a particular kind of patience that is not patience at all, but pressure applied at an angle that does not look like pressure. The estate family has their own attorneys looking at the terms of the original sale. There may be a question about whether items of exceptional undisclosed value were properly represented in the estate inventory. The attorney shifted his weight slightly, which told Darius that this particular argument had some technical merit somewhere and some significant gaps elsewhere, and that the attorney knew which was which and was not entirely comfortable with the ratio. The lot was sold as is. "No warranty, no representation of value," Darius said. Oseibansu Legacy made no claims about the car in either direction. "I reviewed the sale terms before I placed a bid. The purchase is legally complete." The attorney's slight shift became a slight stillness, which was more informative. Terrence studied Darius for a moment with the recalibrating attention of someone who had expected a shorter conversation. Kezia appeared in the interior doorway connecting the shop to the stairwell, biscuit under her arm, looking at the unfamiliar men with the frank curiosity of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned to pretend she is not looking, who has not yet been taught that looking openly at people you do not know is something you are supposed to manage differently. Terrence glanced at her, then back at Darius. And when he looked at Darius again, something in his expression had changed. A new calculation. A different kind of lever being considered and assessed. Darius did not look at Kezia. $300,000, Terrence said. Final. Darius turned his head toward the doorway. "Kezia," he said very calmly. "Go upstairs, please." When the sound of her feet had faded on the stairs, Darius looked at Terrence Beaumont and said in a voice that was quiet and completely even, the voice of a man who has decided something and is simply informing another person of that decision. "You should get in your car and leave before I call my attorney." Terrence Beaumont left. He paused at the door and turned back once, not to speak, just to look at the car on the lift, still in its olive green paint, still battered and dusty, and to any eye but the right one, entirely worthless. His expression was not the expression of a man who had given up. It was the expression of a man reassessing his approach. Darius watched the SUV pull away, picked up his phone, and called Dr. Ford. "We need to move faster," he said. Dr. Evangeline Ford drove down from Tuskegee the next morning in her old Buick, arriving at the Mechanicsville shop at 10 with a leather document case under one arm and a 35mm film camera in a canvas bag over her shoulder. She parked at the curb. She came through the open roll-up door and stopped just inside, looking at the car from 15 feet away, as still as someone who has waited a very long time for something and is not yet certain whether it is what they hoped. She set her bags down and approached slowly, the way you approach something that carries a great deal of weight. Not because the car was fragile, but because the moment was fragile, and she was a woman who understood the difference between things and the weight of things. She crouched beside the engine bay. When she pressed her palm flat against the diagonal weld bar on the firewall, her voice was low and not quite steady. "This is my grandfather's weld," she said. She was not talking to Darius. She was talking to the metal, or to a version of the room that existed somewhere in the early 1960s. A room in a Birmingham warehouse where a man she never met old enough to know worked by feel and light and the deep knowledge of hands that have done a thing 10,000 times. The authentication took 4 hours. Dr. Ford worked with the methodical patience of a woman who had spent 50 years doing this, photographing everything on film, cross-referencing each finding against documents she had brought in the leather case. Original Drummond factory blueprints, her own hand-annotated research logs, a fragmentary set of supplier invoices from 1961 through 1963. The chassis stamp matched. The block casting date matched. The weld geometry matched. And then Dr. Ford found something that even Darius had not found, because it required knowing specifically where to look and why it might be there, the kind of knowledge that only belongs to someone who has spent long enough inside a subject that the subject begins to yield its secrets voluntarily. Tucked into a narrow recess along the inner dash rail, clipped to the frame steel with a small metal fastener, was a cylinder of thin housing, the kind of improvised preservation case that a careful man might construct from materials available in a factory tool room. A man who wanted something to survive and did not trust that it would survive on its own. Inside the cylinder, rolled around a short wooden dowel, was a single sheet of paper. It was a build sheet, a factory production record, dated the 18th of July, 1963. Chassis designation DRTW0001. Engine designation DB V8-0003. Sign-off line at the bottom. Monroe A. Givens, Senior Fabricator. The handwriting was the round, careful cursive of someone who had learned to write in a classroom that did not have enough books and had made up for it in precision. Each letter formed with a deliberateness that had not faded with time or habit. Dr. Ford held the paper in both hands without speaking for a very long time. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bright and full in a way she made no effort to manage or conceal. "He hid it here," she said. He knew the car was going to be moved before the fire. He hid the proof. Darius stood at the doorway of the shop, his hands in his pockets. The late afternoon light coming in at an angle across the floor, catching the dust that floated in the air above the car and making it briefly visible, the way light sometimes makes invisible things visible when it arrives at exactly the right angle. Kezia had come down from upstairs and was standing beside him, her small hand wrapped around two of his fingers, watching the old woman at the workbench with the gravity of a child who understands that something important is happening even if she cannot name it, even if the importance is something she is sensing rather than comprehending, a frequency she can receive without yet having the equipment to fully decode. By 5 o'clock, Dr. Ford had signed and notarized the formal authentication certificate. The document stated, in the precise and unambiguous language of someone who had spent a career preparing to write exactly this sentence, that the vehicle bearing chassis number DRTW0001, engine casting dated July 1963, and factory build sheet signed by Monroe. The Givens was the Drummond D12 factory prototype, the only surviving example, and that its estimated fair market value in the current collector automobile market fell between $7,500,000 and $9 million, with potential for a higher realized price at auction given the historical uniqueness of the piece and the cultural significance of its provenance. Dr. Ford shook Darius's hand at the front door, holding it for a moment before letting go, the particular handshake of someone who wants to hold on to the moment a little longer than the moment allows. "How did you find it?" she asked. Darius glanced down at Kezia, who was leaning against the door frame with Biscuit balanced on top of her head, an arrangement she was maintaining through some private act of concentration. "My father taught me how to look," he said. Dr. Ford nodded, got in her Buick, and drove west into the early evening. Darius went inside and called the main line for Osei Bonsu Legacy Auctions. The call was transferred twice before reaching Renata Osebonsu directly, which was unusual for an unsolicited inbound call. She answered with the practiced efficiency of someone managing a dense schedule. and Darius said what needed to be said without preamble. He owned the Drummond D12. It had been formally authenticated by Dr. Evangeline Ford and Dr. Albert Mensa. He wanted to sell it through Bonsa Legacy in a dedicated single-lot auction. There was a silence on the line that was different from the processing pauses of normal business conversation, longer and shaped differently. The silence of someone rearranging a mental picture rather than retrieving information. The silence of a person who has just been required to substantially revise a held assumption. Lot 47, Renata said. Yes, Darius said. Another silence. I will need to see the authentication documents. Dr. Ford is available for a direct call if you need it. There is the sound of something being set down carefully on a hard surface. We will schedule a special session, she said. Friday. We will handle all the preparation on our end. Her voice had retained its professional precision, but had shed something else, a particular quality of controlled authority that had been present in every previous exchange, the vocal equivalent of looking at someone from a height. The height was still there, but it was arranged differently now. Darius said, "Thank you," and ended the call. That evening, Kezia sat on the high stool beside his workbench while he worked on a 1969 muscle car that had nothing remarkable about it except that it ran and its owner needed it back by the following week. A good car, a useful car, a car that did not require much of him beyond attention and competence. "Are you selling the dirty car?" she asked. "Yes," Darius said, not looking up from the carburetor he was rebuilding, his hands moving through the familiar sequence. "Why? You just got it." Darius set down the float and thought about how to answer in a way that was true and small enough to carry. Small enough for a 6-year-old to hold without it becoming too heavy, but true enough that she would remember it later when she was old enough to understand the full weight of what it meant. "Because some things don't belong in just one person's shop," he said. Kezia considered this, turning biscuit over in her hands. "Like a library book," she said. Darius looked at her. "Exactly like a library book," he said. She seemed satisfied with that. She watched him work until her eyes started closing, the slow defeat of a child who has been awake too long and has finally stopped fighting it. He carried her upstairs without waking her, pulled the blanket up, stood for a moment in the doorway of her room, and then went back down to finish the carburetor. Bonsa Legacy sent the press release at 8 on Friday morning. Special single-lot session. 1963 Drummond D12, sole surviving factory prototype, authenticated by Dr. Evangeline Ford and Dr. Albert Mensa. By 10 o'clock, four international automotive history publications had picked up the announcement. 15 international bidders had registered for remote access. The main bidding room at the Bonsa Legacy venue had more people in it by 11:30 than it typically saw at its flagship spring sales, the room filling with a particular charged quality of collective attention, the atmosphere of a room where everyone present understands that something rare is about to change hands. Darius drove across the city in the same pickup. Kezia beside him in a navy dress with biscuit on her lap. He wore a white button-down shirt and dark trousers. No suit, no tie, nothing that would have made him unrecognizable to anyone who had seen him 5 days earlier in a work jacket crouching beside a car nobody wanted. He parked, took Kezia's hand, and walked through the main entrance. People looked, not because of what he was wearing, but because his name was at the top of the press release, and several of the collectors and dealers in the lobby had the particular alertness of people who have recently been required to recalibrate an assumption about someone, which is a different and more sustained kind of alertness than ordinary attention. Simone Adeyemi met them at the main door with 2 access cards. She looked at Kezia with genuine warmth, crouching slightly to meet the child's eye level. "What is your name?" she asked. "Kezia," the girl said. "And this is Biscuit." Simone smiled the kind of smile that belongs to a person rather than a professional role, and led them to the seller's waiting area, a quiet room off the main hall with upholstered chairs and a window overlooking the courtyard, where the light came through in a way that felt deliberate, like something that had been thought about. Terrence Beaumont was already in the bidding room when Darius walked through before the session began. Seated in the second row, arms folded, jaw set in the particular expression of a man who has decided he can still salvage something from a situation that has moved substantially against him and is not yet ready to conclude otherwise. He had registered to bid. Darius noted this and said nothing about it. Dr. Evangeline Ford was in the front row, her leather document case on the seat beside her, watching the car, which had been brought in on a low platform, cleaned carefully but not restored, every original surface intact and honest. She sat with the patient stillness of someone who is exactly where they were always supposed to be, who has arrived at a destination they were not certain they would reach, and is taking the time to be present in it fully. Renata Osibansu stepped up to the podium. The room quieted. She introduced the lot with the precise historical language that the authentication documents provided. Reading from notes, she had clearly prepared carefully, giving the car's story the space and weight it required. The language measured and deliberate in a way that Darius had not expected and found himself appreciating. Then she opened the bidding at $2 million. $2 million became $4 million in the first 15 seconds. 3 international phone bidders coming in simultaneously from the remote lines. The numbers climbing with the quick, clean urgency of people who had decided in advance what they want and are not interested in hesitation. $4 million became $5,800,000 before 30 seconds had elapsed. Terrence Beaumont raised his paddle at $6 million, and the figure climbed past him. $6,000,005 from a bidder on screen. $7 million from Beaumont. $7,000,008 from the screen. Beaumont, $8 million. The screen went quiet. Renata looked out over the room, her voice steady. $8 million going once. No movement from the screens. Darius was standing at the side of the room, near the wall, one hand resting on Kezia's shoulder. She did not understand the numbers. They were too large, too abstract, outside the scale of anything in her daily life, beyond the reach of any framework she had yet built for understanding what things cost and what they mean. But she was watching her father's face and reading what was there with the acuity that children develop when they have learned to pay close attention to the adults they depend on. She was reading something in his face that she did not have words for yet, but was storing away. $8 million going twice. The room held its breath. The gavel came down. Sold. $8,200,000. The room released. Applause and the murmur of voices and the soft percussion of phones being raised to document the moment. Terrence Beaumont stood, buttoned his jacket without looking at anyone, and walked out through the side door with the unhurried gait of a man managing a defeat in public, the gait of someone who has decided that the manner in which he leaves is the last thing he controls and is going to control it well. Dr. Ford did not stand. She sat in the front row and looked at the car on the platform with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes gone bright and full. She was not crying exactly. She was something adjacent to crying, something that does not have a precise name, the thing that happens when grief and gratitude arrive at the same moment and occupy the same space, when something lost is found, and the finding of it makes the loss more real at the same time as it makes it bearable. Darius looked down at Kezia. She looked up at him. She did not ask about the number. She held Biscuit tighter with one arm and put her other hand into his. Simone Adeyemi took Kezia to the small lounge near the side corridor with a tablet loaded with cartoons. Kezia went willingly, Biscuit already settled on the armrest beside her before the door was halfway closed, already absorbed in whatever was on the screen, the way children move completely from one world to another, without residue. Renata Osibansu found Darius in the hallway outside the main room. Not the imposing corridor of the front entrance, but the quieter passage that led to the administrative offices, where the ceiling was lower and the lighting was warmer, and there was nothing to perform for, no audience for whom a position needed to be maintained. She came alone. No clipboard, no assistant, none of the practiced composure that typically accompanied her public movements. She stood across from him with the posture of someone making a deliberate effort at something, the posture of a person who has decided to be honest and is assembling themselves accordingly. When she said his name, it was without the particular inflection that comes from holding a position of advantage. Darius Chambliss, she said. He waited. What did you see in that car? She asked. Not the rhetorical version of the question, Not the version that is really a statement. Not the version you ask when you already think you know and want to be confirmed. The real one. He considered her for a moment. The firewall reinforcement bar, he said. The weld angle. 71 degrees. The signature of a specific fabricator. You saw that when you were crouching beside it on Tuesday morning. I saw it in the preview photographs that were sent to registered attendees the week before. I was already looking for it when I walked through the door. I needed to confirm it in person. She was quiet for a moment, and he watched something move through her expression. Not the managed shift of someone adjusting their professional position, but the involuntary rearrangement of someone processing the specific weight of what they did, the weight of a thing said in front of other people that cannot be taken back and that landed differently than the speaker intended, or perhaps exactly as intended, which in some ways is worse. I said what I said in front of a lot of people, she said. Not an apology yet. A statement offered precisely, the first piece of the architecture. You did, Darius said. She looked at him steadily. Your daughter was there. Kezia has seen a lot of things, Darius said, and his voice was neither forgiving nor hard, simply honest, the way very few people are when they have something to forgive and choose not to make theater of it, not to use it as a performance of their own generosity. She knows that being right does not mean people will believe you right away. She is learning that. That is okay. Renata held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable, the kind of held gaze that is not a challenge, but a reckoning, a person sitting with what they have just been told without immediately reaching for a response. Your father, she said. What did he do? He passed away 4 years ago. He was a historian. He spent most of his life documenting things other people had stopped documenting, things that had been set aside. And you? He glanced toward the lounge door where Kezia was. I love my daughter, he said simply. The cars are how I take care of that the right way. Renata stood for a moment in the particular stillness of someone who has just heard something that requires no response and knows it, the stillness of a person resisting the habit of filling silence with speech. I will send a formal letter of apology on Monday, she said. That is not necessary, Darius said. Not cold, not performed magnanimity either, not the gracious wave of a man who wants credit for being above it. Just the statement of a man who decided on Tuesday morning, crouching in a dusty hall with a flashlight, that he had no use for other people's opinions of what he could see. He had known what he knew. He had acted on it. The outcome was the outcome. But if you want to send it, he said, that is your decision to make. He gave her a small neutral nod and turned to collect his daughter. 2 weeks passed. Darius did not move the shop, did not buy a new truck, did not hire a sign company to put a new face on the front of the building. He opened a trust account for Kezia at the credit union 3 blocks away, a significant sum, set aside in a structure that would give her options when she was old enough to need them, options with no strings attached to any of them. He kept the remainder in a business account and made plans to expand the shop by 1 bay, which would allow him to take on a second mechanic and stop working every Saturday alone, which had begun to wear on him in the particular way that solitary labor wears on people who are otherwise not solitary. Nothing about the outside of the building changed. The same part supplier calendar was still on the wall. The same coffee maker with a cracked handle sat on the same shelf. The narrow street outside looked as it had always looked. Dr. Ford came by one last time before returning to Tuskegee, pulling up in the Buick with a flat package under her arm. Inside was an old photograph, black and white, 8x10, factory floor. 1963. 2 men standing beside a car that was unmistakably the D12 in its original configuration. The bodywork intact and perfect, the lines of it clean and purposeful. The car had always been underneath everything that had happened to it since. One of the men was Monroe Givens, younger than Darius had ever imagined him, perhaps 35, squinting slightly in the factory lighting, one hand resting on the roof of the car with the comfortable proprietary ease of a man who has built something and knows it. Dr. Ford had written on the back in a careful hand, "To the man who found what my grandfather left behind." Darius hung it on the wall above his workbench, between a wiring diagram for a 1972 coupe and a photograph of his own father standing in front of a race car in a Birmingham paddock sometime in the early 1990s, a young Cornelius Chambliss with his arms crossed and his chin up, and the particular expression of a man who knows something the world has not yet caught up to. The two photographs were hung 4 inches apart, which was not planned but which looked, once it was done, like it had been. On a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the sale, Darius was on his back under the 1969 muscle car, the unremarkable one, the one whose owner just needed it running, when Kezia climbed onto the high stool and began arranging Biscuit on top of the tool chest with architectural precision, positioning and repositioning the bear with the focused intention of someone who has a specific vision and is not going to compromise it. "What are you doing today?" she asked, the way she always asked, as though the answer would determine something important, as though what he was doing mattered to the shape of the day in ways she needed to track. "Looking at a car," Darius said from under the chassis. "Is it a good one?" "I don't know yet. I'm still looking." She thought about this, her hand stilling on Biscuit for a moment. "Like the dirty one," she said. "Like the dirty one," he agreed. She nodded, satisfied, and returned to Biscuit's arrangement. That evening, while he was locking up the shop, his phone buzzed on the workbench. A text from an unfamiliar number, though the initials at the bottom identified the sender without ambiguity. "I want to apologize for what I said that morning. Not because of what the car turned out to be. Because I judged before I looked. I know now what that cost and what it could have cost." ROB Darius read it once, then a second time, standing in the shop with the overhead lights still on and the city going about its business outside the window. He typed a reply. "Thank you for writing this. DC." He set the phone down on the bench, turned off the overhead lights, and stood for a moment in the dark of the shop before heading upstairs. Through the single window above the workbench, the streetlight outside threw a long rectangle across the floor, and in it the 1969 muscle car sat on the lift. Nothing special, nothing hidden, just a car that needed work. He looked at it for a moment anyway. Habit. The habit his father had given him. The habit of looking at ordinary things long enough and carefully enough that ordinary sometimes turns out to be something else entirely. Something that has been there all along, waiting for the right pair of eyes, waiting with the patient indifference of things that do not need to be found in order to remain what they are. There are things people walk past because there is no obvious reason to stop. There are things that sit in the back of rooms, tagged and priced, and largely ignored, waiting for the one person in the room who knows where to look and why, who has been given, by someone who loved them, the particular gift of that knowledge. Most people never meet that person. And that person, quiet, unhurried, wrong by the world's first accounting and right by every accounting that follows, almost never announces themselves. They just crouch down in the back of a hall with a small flashlight, look at the undercarriage of a car that everyone else has written off, and see what no one else took the time to find. Not because they were lucky, because someone a long time ago taught them how to.